Soviet history is one of those things you can't help but be amazed at, kind of like either a train crash that you can't look away from, or just like a really neat looking cake. Particularly when it comes to manufacturing. See, while it's fun to rag on the absolute bonkers things like the AA-20 steam choo-choo, or the insanity that is the Kuznetsov, or whatever they were trying to cook up with the Soviet Harrier that, liked to kill its pilots, you can't fault them for having a go, and giving the ideas that their scientists came up with a fair shake of the sauce bottle. One of these designs, of course, was none other than Korabl Maquette. You probably know it though, and I'm going to refer to it as the Caspian Sea Monster. Welcome back to 5 Minute History, the weekly series where patrons choose the topic. This week we'll be talking about the Caspian Sea Monster. Back in the USSR, no, turn the Beatles off, the Union scientists had some incredibly unique, shall we say, approaches for dealing with certain issues. Rostislav Alexiev was one of these scientists who envisioned a craft that could take advantage of the conditions just above the surface of the water to fly quickly and deliver huge payloads. Now, initially, this idea, the kind of ship-plane thing that had the opportunity to revolutionize passenger travel, was looked at with, wow, this could be really useful. But mostly because it had the unique ability to deliver a swarm of missiles quickly to an unsuspecting target, such as an American aircraft carrier, and run away. You can see how this would be appealing to Soviet High Command and the Politburo too. A super weapon that can strike fast, hit hard, hit often, firing and running away before the enemy can even fire back. And by the time it does fire back, it's usually out of range anyway. It's the stuff of dreams, provided a wave doesn't hit it in the ocean, which, chance in a million. Anyway, funding was provided in the 60s for the design and build of a large new Akronoplan. With this in mind, after initial tests proved the feasibility of the concept. When completed in 1966, the KM, it should be noted, was the largest aircraft in the world at the time, and she could carry the biggest payload to date. I say aircraft in a very loose way here because despite the technicality of being an aircraft, it was considered by the authorities to be closer to a boat. They would therefore assign it to the Soviet Navy, not the Soviet Air Force, although weirdly they would then assign test pilots from the Soviet Air Force to the Soviet Navy to fly the boat, which was actually a plane. Look, all that matters was that the Monster was documented as a marine vessel prior to the voyage, and a bottle of champagne was thrown against its nose. So, technically it's a boat that can fly. Either way, the Sea Monster, or seaplane boat confused thing, had a wingspan of 37.6 metres, a length of 92 metres, and a maximum takeoff weight of 544 metric tonnes. Akronoplans using the ground effect were designed to fly only at an altitude of 5 to 10 metres. Providing this craft with lift, it would rely on 10 Dobrynin RD-7 turbojets, with 2 tail-mounted engines and 8 in canards. Now, the canard engines would only exist to get the craft up to speed and break through and get above the water. Once the vessel was in flight mode, the pilots would shut the canards down and just use the tail-mounted engines to power the craft along for the rest of the journey, before slowing down and then, landing it like a big, seaplane. Yes, this is very much a weight issue in waiting, and because of the extremely low level, not at all dangerous flying. The Monster, though, was undetectable by many of these early radar systems due to this low-level flight, and this kind of off-weighed the risks, and it was a benefit to an extent, but there were still some significant issues with this. Anyway, on the 22nd of June 1966, the newly built Akronoplan was transported down the Volga River to begin testing on the relatively calm waters of the Caspian Sea, not too far from the town of Kaspiisk. It's pretty clear that the Soviets genuinely believed they had something special here, because they took great pains to keep it secret. The Akronoplan was transported while covered in camouflage and moved only at night. After her arrival at any necessary reassembly from the journey, the vehicle was commissioned formally into Soviet service and set about testing. The first flight was actually achieved on the 16th of October 1966, performed by Vladimir Loganov and Rostislav Alexiev himself, which is very unusual as most Soviet aircraft designers don't really pilot their own creations. I know it seems morbid, but at the end of the day, if the design was to fail, then generally speaking you don't want the designer to die in the crash, you want him alive to fix it. But it just goes to show how convinced he was that this would work. Testing would show that the design did actually work, and decently well. It had an optimum cruising speed of 430 km an hour or 232 knots, at a maximum operational speed of 500 km an hour or 270 knots. The Soviet forces did actually push it to see how fast the vehicle could go, but sources here vary between the very plausible and the propaganda, going so high as to estimating 740 kilometers an hour or 400 knots, which in my opinion, that number is just a touch too round, if you get what I mean. Now, initially, although the results were promising, there were some issues, and people started to realize them pretty damn quickly. The cost alone of the craft, when compared to conventional weapons, was astronomical. And the fact that, if it hit a wave, it would, pop. And, hitting a wave in the ocean, particularly the North Atlantic, where this thing was meant to kind of operate against the carriers it was going to have to fight, you can kind of start to see an issue here. And because of this, authorities began to lose interest. Testing would continue for 15 years though until 1980 when it was destroyed following a crash caused by pilot error. There were no human casualties, but the Caspian Sea Monster was damaged and no attempts were made to save it. The Soviet forces, mind you, it was the 80s and everything was kind of starting to go to pot, abandoned the craft, and after just a few days to a week, sources vary, it sort of just bobbed around and sank in place, in full view of the men ashore. The Caspian Sea Monster did, however, spawn a child. We know it as the Lun class from the early 80s, and only one was built. And it was removed from service shortly after the USSR collapsed, and after lounging around on a beach for a while, it's since become a museum craft, I guess you would call it, in Russia. Interestingly, the designer and father of the Ukranoplan program himself had died in 1980 when testing an Ukranoplan that was set to be unveiled at the Moscow Olympics. So, father and son died in the same year. As for the Lun class though, I might come back to it one day and have a chat about it. Generally speaking, it too was a massive failure, and it never left the Caspian Sea, which, given in the Caspian Sea the Soviet, later Russian navies, all they had to really consider fighting in the 60s was the Shah's navy, and then after that, absolutely nobody, because of Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan were part of the Soviet Union. So it's kind of a waste of time, money, and in general, it was completely pointless to have it. They were just a waste. Very cool waste, but a waste nonetheless. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you to the patrons, and I'll catch you all next time.